Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and today I'll be breaking down the motion this house as the feminist movement regrets chivalry. So, as proposition, the first thing you need to do is identify what is chivalry, and the Infoslide has stated this for us. They basically said that these are traditional practices where men offer courteous treatment to women, such as opening doors, paying for dates, insisting on driving them home, etc. But it's not enough for you to just keep this as your entire definition, because the problem with a term like chivalry or soft motions like this is that it's the way in which it manifests is going to change from context to context. So even if you say that chivalry looks like XYZ on proposition, it's likely that opposition will recharacterize it in a different way, and both those manifestations are likely. You just need to explain why yours is more likely. That is why it's important in your setup to explain why chivalry originated and the way in which it originated. And the way you do this as proposition is to say that chivalry was entrenched in patriarchal ideas that women were weaker and needed to be protected, which by itself might not sound like a bad thing if it didn't exist in a vacuum. So it was promoted in two ways that made like this manifestation of chivalry really toxic. Firstly, it was a play on toxic masculinity. I already explained that what constitutes as chivalrous is very hard to define. But the reason why the patriarchy was able to hijack this narrative of chivalry and pass off their version of it was by weaponizing the hero complex and playing on toxic masculinity. So the way in which they did this is by saying that if you don't engage in this behavior that we deem as chivalrous, you are weak, you're not a real man. And then it makes it harder for men to question whether these acts of chivalry were born from a place of respect for women, or whether they are conditioned to promote behavior that might be potentially oppressive to women simply because they don't want to appear inferior. For example, are you paying your date's bill, which is an example for chivalry, because you respect the woman, or because of the internalized stereotype that men are the providers, and if your date pays, that's an insult to your masculinity? So basically what you're trying to explain here is that men are unable to reject potentially oppressive versions of chivalry because they don't want to be portrayed as inferior or less manly. The second way that the patriarchy hijacks this narrative is through stereotyping. If men being chivalrous is now perceived as positive behavior in society and is in fact an expectation of a good man, men were simultaneously told that submissive women who needed saving were more desirable. These two occurrences were interlinked, and the existence of chivalry caused this stereotyping. And this is very similar, or it actually caused stereotypes and tropes such as the damsel in distress, where the appeal for soft-spoken women who looked more petite and fragile and were in need of saving became like higher. So now you make this mechanization and you add it to like what this chivalry looks like. And this is the implication of your setup. You're going to say that varying versions of chivalry might exist. And opposition will probably run something about a version of chivalry that originated because women were respected and needed to be protected. You need to keep that in mind. But what you've done through this setup is to prove that the toxic version of chivalry that comes from a place where women are perceived as lesser than is likely to be the most dominating narrative because of how persuasive these stereotypes that you mechanized and toxic masculinity are. So opposition needs to prove why these mechanisms that you proven aren't as very coercive, or they need to prove why it's easy to undo the generations of patriarchy manipulating the idea of chivalry in a very toxic way. So that kind of gives reasons as to why your setup is more likely at the top itself. So when you think of this motion, now that we've covered setup, you need to think of what your burden is. It's a this house regrets motion, right? Which means it's a retrospective motion. So you typically need to be thinking about how you can prove that chivalry brought about more harm than good. So the way you do this is by looking at how chivalry has impacted current society, whether there's a negative or positive impact, whether it was like necessary for a certain change to occur, and what would change if chivalry didn't exist at all. So that's basically how you should be going about this house regrets motions. Okay, so that's basically some stuff that you can do for setup. Obviously this would change based on like what strategy your team wants to take, but this is what I would have typically gone with. So for argument ideas, maybe you can run a big argument on why this is bad for women. And note that when you talk about the feminist movement and women within the feminist movement, it's not sufficient to generalize the impacts to all women, because women come from diverse backgrounds, they have diverse beliefs, and their incentives and the impacts that leak down to these women will also change based on those things. So maybe you could explain and break it down to progressive contexts, conservative contexts, and break down your stakeholders, so it becomes, fragment your stakeholders, so it becomes clear as to which portion you're talking about. So why is chivalry bad in progressive context? The first thing you want to do is a little bit characterize this kind of analysis by saying that it's very hard to undo the implicit conditioning the patriarchy has imposed on society for generations. This means that most men are likely to have a degree of internalized misogyny to some extent, even within progressive contexts, because obviously the opposition is going to run analysis on how the feminist movement has like redefine what chivalry means, etc., etc. So you want to kind of counteract that characterization prematurely. Okay, so why is this bad in progressive context then? Most men want to engage in chivalry because they view that course of behavior as their role in a relationship. That's how they're made to think. However, in these progressive contexts, women are becoming more self-sufficient. They're becoming more independent, and they don't necessarily need this kind of action in their life. And this creates insecurity because men start feeling as if they're not needed in the relationship. And this insecurity means that some men might retaliate negatively. For example, they might be labeling these women as feminazis. They might be extra possessive or controlling of these women because they don't feel that they are useful in relationship, in a relationship. And in the West, you've seen like this occurrence of passport bros, where basically they start dating women from like other parts of the world because they think that Western women are too headstrong, too stubborn, too independent, etc., etc. So all of these impacts might have been directly linked to chivalry being a social expectation and to men being conditioned to believe that the way in which they showcase their worth in a relationship is through these chivalrous acts. So in instances where these chivalrous acts aren't needed by the woman, they feel unwanted, they feel insecure, and they might retaliate in these ways. I do want to note that maybe the progressive women in progressive context might not become the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate because they are in a relatively better position than women stuck in conservative context, but that doesn't mean that you need to give up the stakeholder entirely. And the way you finish off this analysis is to say that even if there are some people or men who are completely free of bias, they are a minority and will probably treat women well irrespective of the existence of social norms like chivalry. But the majority are likely to be affected this way. And it's important to think of that analysis because you need to prove likelihood of why your analysis occurs, because you can't generalize an impact to every single person, especially in these kinds of motions. Okay, the second thing you can talk about is how this solidifies gender roles. And here you kind of characterize that the feminist movement is going to promote men to respect and treat women well on both sides of the house. But the problem is doing it through means of endorsing chivalry, because chivalry dilutes this effort since it's entrenched in gender roles. The reason it's entrenched in gender roles is because what is chivalrous is based on the conventional idea of what roles a partner should play in a relationship. For example, paying for your date at a micro level doesn't seem very harmful. In fact, it might seem like something a gentleman would do. But it branches from the school of thought that implies that men are the ones who should be holding financial responsibility in a relationship. Men are the providers and women are like the homebodies. So basically, what is chivalrous and what is a gentlemanly thing to do also is implicitly rooted in our perception of what gender roles each gender should be playing. And then you make this kind of analysis and say that the existence of chivalry masks sexism and makes it easier to pass it off as a social expectation instead. And this is especially terrible in conservative contexts, because this is when it becomes easier for the patriarchy to condition people to engage in this oppressive behavior and solidify their power. Why is this? Firstly, men think that they're doing the right thing, right? Even if they might be sympathetic towards women and their causes and not necessarily misogynistic, you're able to pass off this masked sexism as a social expectation. So men themselves think that they are living up to this social expectation and treating women well, when in reality they are not empowering women. So it's easier for the patriarchy to indoctrinate them by weaponizing this concept of chivalry. Secondly, women think that they are being treated well, and they are also likely to be conditioned to be passive, even when it comes to like blatant instances where their autonomy is curbed. For example, like allowing your date to pay for your meal might not seem like a big deal, right? But when it comes to bigger instances where you're told to like quit your job and stay at home because it's the man's responsibility to provide for you, you might think that that's actually an honor, and in some cases it might be an honor. But in this specific instance, it might be an oppressive way for like the patriarchy to strip you of your financial autonomy. But you don't even realize that, because you think that this is also like an extension of chivalry or an extension of the social obligations that are imposed upon like your partner. And then you basically say that, look, we acknowledge that the patriarchy is going to be like sexist and like tighten their grip in this conservative context, but chivalry exclusively provides a very good tool to kind of manipulate people and impose indoctrination more severely. And then you basically say that in the absence of chivalry, it's more likely that women will acknowledge that the system is broken when they aren't conditioned to accept sexist behavior, when they aren't conditioned to perceive that being treated as lesser than is a good thing. And it's easier to like make them aware to gain critical mass. And it's also harder to play off like men's toxic masculinity and all of the stuff that I explained before. And basically you explain why it's harder for the patriarchy to weaponize this. So that's like a lot of analysis that you can run and think about the various implications that chivalry has had. Then you could also say that the very idea of chivalry by itself is demeaning to the messaging of the feminist movement, because the idea of chivalry is rooted in the fact that women are incapable, women need to be protected, and women need the help of a man, which is contradictory to the messaging that the feminist movement has been engaging in for so long, that women are equal, women should be capable of like achieving their own goals, etc. And then maybe some other analysis you can look into is how this might create unrealistic expectations in women about men if you're analyzing the stakeholder of men. So a good guy holds the door open for you and buys you flowers and pays for your dates, and that's your version of what a good guy is. But in reality, relationships are changing and shifting, and a good guy doesn't always necessarily fit that mold. But the idea of chivalry has created these unrealistic expectations that might also be toxic for men. So these are some analysis that you can run as the proposition. Obviously you can elaborate on this and make them arguments, or you can also think of other stakeholders and extend on this. So for opposition, this setup, you basically want to recharacterize what chivalry means on the opposition and say that chivalry originated from the idea that women are respected within society and needed to be treated well. So instead of the idea of chivalry doesn't endorse equality in all instances, because there are differences between men and women, right? But instead it endorses equity, equality through equity. So for example, you insist on driving a woman home not because you think they're inferior or incapable, but because it's an acknowledgement of the problems women face while traveling alone. And the feminist movement has already considerably redefined chivalry so that it's not rooted in completely archaic norms in the way proposition points out, right? So that's like the recharacterization you want to do on side opposition. And you say that this is a retrospective motion. And this is important because for the feminist movement to achieve any sort of change, it was very, very hard to destroy sexism completely overnight, right? And suddenly advocate for radical change. Especially like in the 90s, it was very difficult to give women all of these rights all of a sudden. But chivalry reflected the transitionary period in society. It was an expression of feminism by men, right? It was the first expression of feminism by men in the past and not one of oppression. So the existence of chivalry paved the way for modern day feminism because it was the initial step in recognizing that women are a valuable part of society. So basically you're trying to say that the feminist movement wanted to establish that women deserve rights, but it was very difficult for them to make that radical change overnight. And the first step towards achieving that change is to create this notion that women are valuable contributors to society. Obviously, the way that this was achieved was through things like chivalry, right? Chivalry is rooted in the idea that women are important, women need to be protected, and women should be respected. And basically you say that it's kind of a premature demonstration of feminism in the past, and if chivalry didn't exist, it would have been difficult for feminism as a whole to like exist in the version that it does now in the present. So I guess that's one way you can characterize chivalry, though obviously you'll have to like argue and think of more reasons as to why this characterization is true. So to also think about what proposition said, you can also say that like gender roles and oppressive ideas are going to exist regardless of chivalry. If chivalry didn't exist on proposition side, people are going to be conditioned to internalize misogyny through other equally persuasive outlets like religion or culture, right? The problem isn't chivalry inherently, it's the patriarchy who weaponizes chivalry. But because the feminist movement is redefining chivalry, they are able to take back some of the power that the patriarchy had previously. And basically you need to make your setup responsive to whatever the side proposition is going to run and set it up in a way that is positive for you. Okay, so what kind of analysis can opposition run? You can also think about why the existence of chivalry might be good for women. Firstly, it might be a stepping stone in the way that I explained, right? The idea that chivalry existed because women were perceived as important, and that like helped for the feminist movement to advocate for more rights and protections to be assigned to women. You could also say that men who were chivalrous were easier to transform into allies of the feminist movement because in general they tended to be more sympathetic towards the problems women faced and more respectable of women. But something very interesting I think you can run on opposition is that even within present society, it's very difficult to completely reform conservative context radically, right? Or reach the women who are stuck in this conservative context or deprived of their rights. So feminism isn't necessarily effective for the people who need it the most. The only possible way to better the lives of the women who are stuck in those areas is by weaving feminist ideologies into the courses of behavior that are accepted within the societies, like chivalry. So I know this sounds really technical, but think about it in this example. You can't advocate that women, like in the Middle East, for example, get jobs immediately, right? You can't advocate that all of them have financial autonomy because that misogyny is so deeply rooted in their cultural belief system, especially in conservative contexts. But you can make it a social obligation for men to provide for women and treat them well, given that women are financially dependent. So instead of like creating this radical change, you can at least make sure that the most vulnerable are protected within the society by kind of reclaiming chivalry and slowly trying to convert it into a feminist belief. So since these women are completely vulnerable, instead of saying that they should all go out and get jobs, which is a very difficult thing to achieve, you could instead say that men should be treating these women well, should be providing for their needs, should be paying for like the dates and like their necessities in general, and ensuring that these women are protected. And that's the way that you can reach these most vulnerable women who are arguably a very, very important stakeholder in this debate that basically the proposition excludes by rejecting the concept of chivalry. Then I guess that's one way you can think about like how you can help women on opposition. Another possible line of argumentation you can think of is about the feminist movement and this idea of hyper independence. rejecting like the existence of chivalry entails notions that like women taking care of men is weak and unnecessary, and it also like promotes this idea that relying on men means that you're not a feminist, right? And why that is bad is that extreme versions of feminism that reject men and their contributions entirely become stronger, become more influential along with the rejection of chivalry. And that is when it's easier to label the feminist movement as radical. But also, you're going to alienate portions of the feminist movement that see the appeal in chivalry, that actually want their partners to behave in this type of way. And these kind of women depend on their male counterparts. They do not see the idea of depending on your male counterparts as you being weak. But if the feminist movement is rejecting chivalry in its entirety, that means that you're implicitly signaling that if you depend on your male counterpart for XYZ reasons, that is not feminist. And that's pretty bad, because in the feminist movement you have different types of feminists, right? You have feminists who are completely fine with being independent and don't necessarily want to rely on a man, and then you have more conservative feminists who are also feminists, but they don't have a problem with like relying on their man. They don't have a problem with having their needs met by their partner. So there's going to be infighting within the movement, and also a massive exclusion if the feminist movement rejects chivalry as a whole, because now they're kind of implicitly endorsing like man-hating and extreme versions of feminism that exclude men entirely. And that's pretty bad for one, the perception of the movement, two, like the stability of the movement. If there's infighting, the movement isn't very like, there's no solidarity. And thirdly, like for like the funding and stuff that happen, and reputation of the movement. So those are arguments that the opposition can think about for chivalry. So what are the clashes that will happen in this debate? I think firstly there might be a clash on the most likely interpretation of chivalry, because both opposition and proposition are going to run different interpretations of chivalry, so you'll have to have a clash on characterization. Maybe there will be a clash on what's most beneficial for women in general and what women want in general. So like women in conservative areas, women in progressive areas, you'll have to break down stakeholders like that and explain what women want in general. Then there might also be a clash on what is good for the movement, and which side is able to achieve the most change for the movement, or whether chivalry was essential for the progression of the movement or not, because this is this house regrets motion. Yeah, so I hope that this helped all of you, and if you have any questions, I guess you can message the DC if that's possible. Okay, bye.